Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Full burgers.
Why is that?
Because we went out for burgers.
Yeah, we don't do it often, but when we do.
We don't know. We had a celebration, which was nice, but now I'm very full.
Yeah. It is probably not a good idea to do before recording a podcast.
No.
We kind of envisaged this might be the case.
We did, yeah.
We did a risk assessment.
Yeah. Good thing we know our guest reasonably well.
It won't be a problem, I think, for today's guest at all.
I think she'll do beautifully.
Yeah, but I've got my caffeine ready to get me through this one. Joelle, I might have to carry you, I think, this time, and maybe carry you to your car afterwards because you are looking quite sluggish. I'm sure you'll wake up.
I'll be fine.
Okay. Well, look, without further ado, we should probably then introduce our guest today. She is an organizational psychologist and the principal psychological health and safety specialist at WorkSafe Victoria. Her team of psychological health and safety specialists focus on prevention of psychological injury in Victorian workplaces. She has experience in public and private industries, as well as in academia. She's published research on fatigue, stress, and impacts of work on mental health. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Libby Brook.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Joelle. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see the doctor. That's a funny story, isn't it, in itself, that doctor? How long did it take you to get your doctorate, Libby?
Just a little while.
I remember it was a running joke for quite a while, and I'm glad you finally got it done, because that was only about a year or two ago that you finally got it done, didn't you?
It was, yes. I've actually had to delay my graduation ceremony. They've conferred my degree, but I've had to delay my graduation ceremony because of the border being closed. Because of course it's in WA.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we'll welcome you in from next week. So that's great. It is great that the borders are finally opening, and I know you've got family over here, so it'll be great for you to be able to get back with the family and see your family. So that'll be great.
No, it will be good.
All right, Libby. Are there any podcasts that you like to listen to?
Well, I don't get much of a chance to listen to podcasts at all, but this is actually the only podcast that I listen to when I listen to a podcast. So when I get an opportunity, it's this one because it's the most relevant and interesting to me. So well done.
And I think a lot of our guests would say the same. This is the only one worthwhile listening to.
That's a perfect response. And we did not script that with Libby, listeners.
Yeah, and don't search anything else on Spotify or Apple. This is the only podcast that those podcast platforms have.
Yeah.
Take our word for it.
The only reason they exist is for us.
Yeah, well, since Joe Rogan got cancelled, right?
Yeah. Joe who?
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us about your professional career, Libby.
So I did all my undergrad, masters and doctorate in WA, or most of the doctorate in WA, finished it off in Victoria, and started out my career working in prisons as a psych, and went into the army. I worked in construction for a while and worked in academia for quite a long time, lecturing in organisational psychology, in particular work and wellbeing was my favourite area, of course. And did some consulting into oil and gas and other consulting work, and then moved to Victoria with an opportunity to join the WorkSafe Specialist Services area with as a senior ergonomist at the time. They didn't have an org psych position until about 8 months after I started, and since then it's grown into a new team last year. And yes, I have 5 senior psych health and safety specialists in my team with me, which is wonderful.
So you've got a bunch of psychologists reporting to you.
Yes, yeah, it's great. They're wonderful. No, they're great. They're amazing.
It's a polite bunch, and they all agree with each other all the time.
We have some wonderful debates and discussions. It's great.
Libby, it's really great timing to have you on because obviously WorkSafe Victoria has just released a proposed set of OHS amendment regulations dealing with psychological health. And that's obviously in consultation phase at the moment when this podcast airs. So can you maybe first of all give us a bit of background on why these regs have been drafted?
Yeah, so as we all know, so mental injuries can be some of the most expensive workers' comp claims, and it's partly due to the complexity, but also around the longer duration of claims as well. So it's something that there's been a focus on. And if we look at, for example, the average duration of claims for mental injuries in Victoria, it was 37.5 weeks in 2020. So that's a significant amount of time to be off work, which is more than double the average duration for other types of injuries. So it's a really a really important area for us to focus on with regards to prevention and also making a difference in this space in Victoria. So what we found is that there's generally a limited understanding around workplace mental health, as well as there's some challenges around definitions and the nature of psychological hazards and differences across different states, slightly nuanced. What we find is that generally responses to workplace mental health have traditionally focused on the injuries, so the individual with the injuries, rather than focusing on that preventative space when it comes to the actual hazard and looking at the underlying psychosocial hazards that might be negatively impacting on that employee's mental health. So moving it back to the organisation, focusing on the controls that they could put in place for the prevention in the organisation rather than the injury and the injured person so much. So, yeah, sorry, go.
Yeah, so I was thinking, with that, you obviously go in and see a lot of workplaces in Victoria, and your team would as well. You mentioned there's some confusion, or there's some approaches that are more dominant than others. How are companies typically dealing with mental health in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, a lot of people will point to an EAP or point to policies, procedures or training or something like that that they have. And while they can be very helpful and very necessary at times, we are interested in looking at any underlying causes, if there's job demands or something like that, underlying those issues that they should be targeting and controlling better.
Yeah, it's definitely been a theme of, I guess, the podcast where when we've had guests on and they share, what are they seeing in the market, there's definitely more of a focus on the individual and the injury or the symptoms of ill health, rather than going, well, let's go upstream and think about, well, what are the systemic causes of that and dealing with it at that root cause, rather than, just waiting until an injury occurs.
Yep.
So Libby, is there any other reasons why the regulations have been drafted?
Yeah, so we had, following on from the Productivity Commission's report on mental health and the Boland Review, which, one of the recommendations from the Boland Review was that regs be developed, and that particularly in the Work Health and Safety Act, that the incident notification provisions should be reviewed as well. And following on from that, the Minister for Workplace Safety in Victoria actually asked WorkSafe to explore the inclusion of the reporting requirements from that. But the Productivity Commission also, pointed to the importance of promoting mental health in a work setting, and the need to equip workplaces better to be mentally healthy, and that then, I guess, led to our minister announcing on the 17th of May 2021 that, so that's our Minister for Workplace Safety, Ingrid Stitt MP, she announced that the Victorian government were committed to introducing regulations to addressing psych health.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, the timing of that announcement, because I believe the Commonwealth WHS ministers were about to meet and review that recommendation, or a number of recommendations from the Boland Review, including that one about psychological injury. And Victoria came out
Absolutely.
before that meeting and said that, yes, they were going to do something in this area.
Absolutely. I think, well, they were all, I think it was a very topical at the time. So, yes.
That's great. Look, someone's got to lead the charge, right? So it's
Absolutely.
great that you guys are ahead of the curve.
Absolutely.
No competition there at all.
No, we actually work really closely, really well with the other WorkSafes and Safe Work Australia. So, no, it's great. We work well together.
Yeah, and it's only fair because, there's obviously been a significant drive in WorkSafe. Just the other day, we had Jennifer Fry on from Workwell on the podcast. And, that was a $50 million investment from the state government in Victoria into, scalable solutions for workplace mental health. And, New South Wales did the one-upmanship at that point in time and put $55 million into workplace mental health soon after that. So it's only fair that Victoria get in front again, right?
That's it. And Jen Fry's doing an amazing job in Workwell too, I'll just say.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just because we're a funding recipient. No, she is doing an amazing job. Yes.
That's it.
So anything on the objectives, the main objectives then of the regs, Libby?
Yeah, so the regs will help to give some clarity around our expectations and increase the employer's state of knowledge across the state. So it'll basically give them some guidance around what they should be doing, particularly as it relates to psychological health, because I think part of the challenge is interpreting the Occupational Health and Safety Act in a way that is relevant for psychological hazards isn't necessarily something that people find particularly easy. So they wanted some guidance around this. So the regs will help them to understand that. It also helps to promote the importance of psych health and safety in the workplace by giving it equal standing, so to speak, to the other regs, which are physical in nature. And it also will clarify, proposes to clarify employer requirements to review and, if necessary, revise measures for control after there's an incident at certain points. So, which is really good to see when it comes to, if something happens in the workplace, you can't just keep that level of control there. You actually need to look at, are these controls good enough? Do we need to change them?
Yeah, that's good to see. I mean, we have seen a number of organisations who will put controls just in their risk register, and a lot of them will just be policies, and they don't ever go back and change them. They're like, oh, we've got a bullying and harassment policy, or we've got a leave policy, or anything like that, and they'll just point to that to deal with the overall risk of psychosocial. But they never really review it in line with actual events.
Yep. Some of the other things it will require them to do a written prevention plan, or that's proposed to require them to do a written prevention plan for certain hazards, and also to periodically report to WorkSafe certain instances of complaints of bullying, sexual harassment, aggression, or violence.
Yeah. And sexual harassment is something that's gotten a fair bit of publicity at the moment here, particularly in the West and in the mining industry. And so I think everyone can understand why that might be the case with the regulators, not just WorkSafe, but as the Commonwealth regs come out, why the regulators might want to keep an eye on those those data points.
Yeah, absolutely.
So looking at the regs, they start out with describing some duties of employers. How are those duties different to the general duties required under the Act?
The general duties and the requirements under the Victorian Occupational Health and Safety Act to have a safe workplace and to have safe systems in place. Some employers and some feedback has been that it's not necessarily clear enough what they need to do and what our expectations are. So the regs help provide that clarity. So we found that businesses, in particular small businesses, just have that limited understanding, and regs are potentially going to help give them that guidance that they need to be able to manage those risks better.
So within that, sort of talking about the duties of the employers, then there's Regulation 448B, which stipulates a control of risk approach. Why was that regulation included?
Yeah, so the regulation directs duty holders to eliminate where they can, where it's possible, and then some guidance around our expectations of control of risk when they can't eliminate it. And that was one of the key areas that helps to explain our expectations a little bit better in that space. Yeah.
So can you take the listeners through those steps?
Yeah, so the control of risk, if we're looking at that section, it proposes that, so if you can't eliminate it, then you alter the management of work, the plant, the systems of work, the work design, or the workplace environment, or using information instruction or training. And there's a stipulation on that you can't only rely on information instruction and training unless the others aren't applicable. So it's basically saying that there are things that you can do, such as look at your work design, for example, and change that as a means of controlling the risk.
Yeah, so I suppose, what we commonly see is that organisations a lot of the time will default to a policy level control, or write a code of conduct, yeah. Or will give people some training or something like that. So it seems like what the regs are doing there is really instructing employers that they actually need to work a little bit harder and do some real work to reduce exposure to hazards, rather than just relying on those sort of administrative controls.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what surprised me was the requirement for prevention plans for certain psychosocial hazards. Why were some particular psychosocial hazards singled out? What were they, first of all, and why were they singled out?
Yeah. Well, if we're looking at so we looked at research from our data, our claims data, and we looked at Safe Work Australia data and publications, and Safe Work New South Wales mentally healthy workplaces, return on investment discussion paper, and Senate inquiries into mental health, first responders, and reports from Human Rights Commission. So there was a really broad net of resources and information that was covered, and it indicated that bullying, high job demands, sexual harassment, trauma, and work-related violence led to disproportionate harm in comparison with other psychosocial hazards. So that led to an approach where those were then asked for a prevention plan. So it's proposed that they are treated as, called out as, a focal point when it comes to wanting to prevent those in particular because of that disproportionate harm.
Yeah, okay. And I guess for something like bullying, harassment, or sexual harassment, if there is a accusation or claim made back to the organisation, well, yeah, you can identify that hazard exists or that has occurred. Mm-hmm. What about something like job demands? Like, how would an employer recognise that that's an issue and then need a prevention plan?
Yeah. So when we're looking at people working long hours, people saying that their workload's too high, that they're not coping, when you know that you have a workplace that has particularly emotional demands as well, those are going to be identified as part of the process for the rest of the regs. So we're looking at identifying those hazards, and if they're identified, then if it falls within this category, it's proposed that there will be a prevention plan written up.
Yeah, I think all of our listeners would understand things like bullying, harassment, exposure to occupational violence, sexual harassment, that sort of thing. They can understand how you'd have that adverse reaction from a mental health perspective as an employee. Maybe surprisingly to some, I remember seeing some workers' compensation statistics myself, and I believe it was 20% of psych injuries were due to workload. So it's actually quite commonplace, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good to see that the regulations are dealing with that, and not just the big ones like sexual harassment and bullying.
Yeah, no, it is. It was one of the areas that I see a lot going out into workplaces. So it's really good that it's in there, proposed to be in there. And of course, anything can change based on feedback. But at this stage, that's where we've proposed that it is.
Yeah, I think you guys have got a good leg to stand on, though, if anyone was to say, well, we should take that one out, given the proportion of workers' compensation claims that are due to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So will WorkSafe be publishing a code of practice then to help employees meet that requirement?
Yeah, so to help employers meet their duties under the Act and the proposed regs and how they fit, we are developing a compliance code for psychological health. It will include things like how to identify and control the risks of psychological health. And so while that's not mandatory, duty holders that comply with the code will be taken to comply with their duties under the Occ Health and Safety Act and the regs.
So the next element, I guess, of the regs is the duty to report certain types of psychosocial complaints to the regulator. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's proposed. It's a proposed requirement to tell WorkSafe the number of complaints that they've had for certain prescribed areas every 6 months. So that'll be mid-year and end of year. And the proposed regs would require information on complaints of bullying, sexual harassment, aggression or violence, and it will only apply to employers with 50 employees or more.
And so those would be like where people have made a formal complaint to HR or to their employer about those things? Yeah,
correct. And so the information that they need to collect from that would be the number of reports, first of all, the gender of the people involved. So if there's more than one person, and the description of a relationship between them. So if we're looking at the sexual harassment, for example, what was the relationship, if any, between them? Were they co-workers? Was there a boss? Was there a subordinate? Just to collect a little bit of data around that. Yeah.
So what does WorkSafe intend to do with those reports?
Yeah. Well, we know that in general, there's underreporting of hazards to WorkSafe. We know not everyone puts in a claim, not everyone calls us on the advisory line. So we know that is likely to be underreporting in the state. So this data will help us to understand the actual prevalence of these psychosocial complaints in the state. And so we could use this data to gather information on, industry level data. We could look at business size to see if that's relevant, potentially incident type and frequency, and basically that would feed into our strategic interventions. So not everything that we do is response work. Some of what we do is strategically designed so that we can actually try and prevent injuries.
Yeah, okay. So you're looking at it more from a group data perspective rather than saying, this company has sent us this number of reports, so we need to go and investigate that company right away.
Yes, that's the intent. Yeah.
Yeah, because I imagine there might be some reluctance from organisations to send those reports through if they're concerned that it's going to result in further scrutiny, perhaps.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah,
potentially.
I won't ask you to speculate further on that.
Thank you.
So I guess thinking about, from an organizational structure, if people internally are making these types of complaints, they'd normally, those complaints would be made to HR or the people and culture function. But then we're talking about, health and safety regulations. Do you think that this part of the regs might change some of the structures or functions, particularly within large organizations?
necessarily the structures or functions per se. The duty's always been there for health and safety to be managed at the workplace, and that has included psychological health under the Act. But I guess this specifically calls out some areas that potentially, even us going into workplaces, we will talk to people in culture or HR people, and not necessarily health and safety people because of the nature of what's going on. But it will help organisations, or it should help organisations to understand that psychosocial hazards are health and safety hazards, and they must be managed the same way that you would look at a physical hazard. They can't just be ignored or siloed because they're dealt with by HR. It's not my area, or people in culture. So yes, there may be some considerations to be had around privacy. There probably, when it comes to individual data and individual information, but the fact that there has been a hazard reported, or that there's been a hazard that's been identified, it needs to be treated as a psychosocial hazard.
Yeah. And so I guess hopefully as well, what that would encourage is maybe some better collaboration between the HR and safety functions, rather than them engaging in turf protection.
Absolutely. It should be something that should be a regular conversation. If something's going on, it shouldn't be siloed within an organisation. No one wins by that. It's not a positive for an organisation to silo off information like that when it's causing harm.
Yeah, and we do often hear that, for instances of bullying or sexual harassment, often, the safety department only hears about it after a disciplinary process has been carried out and, somebody's been terminated or given warning or something like that, where, if ideally you would want them to be involved much earlier on in that process so that they could actually look at, what's going on in the work environment that's facilitating this type of behaviour.
Well, often it's also the point where the person's been off work for a number of weeks or months.
Yeah, and they need to engage in the return to work process.
That's right.
Yeah. It's such a good point, Joelle. If you don't look at any work factors that may be leading to, or work-related factors that might leading to these problems, so work pressure is a good example, sometimes can cause or be one of the causing factors in interpersonal challenges at work, and that can come out through that bullying process. But if you don't then stop the challenges that are happening behind the scenes of the work hazard, the actual work pressure, you put anyone else in the situation and it may happen again. So it's really important to have that preventative focus and actually be able to look to manage that hazard.
Yeah, and so often we look at, I guess, who we might refer to as the perpetrators of those behaviours as being, the instigator or the initiator of that problem as well, where, sometimes their behaviour is actually, a consequence of the working environment and the pressures that they're put upon or, put under as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great point that health and safety and HR, if they can work collaboratively in this area, then HR hopefully can benefit from, I guess, health and safety having more systems thinking as a profession typically.
I love hearing that, Jason. That's gold.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what would you say to business owners then who view the introduction of these regs as an unnecessary regulatory burden?
Yeah. Look, there is already a duty there to have a safe workplace without risks to psychological health and safety. It's in the Act already. They should be identifying and controlling that risk already. The WorkSafe considers that the preparation of those prevention plans, for example, is not anticipated to be impractical or unreasonable. And it's also expected to contribute to productivity benefits, because we know that if we have a safe workplace, that it actually is a positive for productivity, happy, safe workers, and also people, for example, there's less turnover, there's good organisational benefits to it as well. So accompanying the proposed regs document is the RIS, which is a very long document, but it's well worth a read if you're interested in understanding the cost benefits, because it actually goes through and nuts out the cost benefits of introducing these proposed regs. And if we look at, for example, the obligations will just make sure that workplaces are actually monitoring and observing those psychosocial incidents in the workplace, and they actually hopefully will increase employers' state of knowledge when it comes to understanding what they are, how to identify them, and also how to control them, how to make their workers safe at work when it comes to psychological health and safety.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah, and I guess then there's obviously, as you've said in the RIS, but that talks about the benefits as well in terms of productivity and reduced absenteeism, reduced presenteeism, all of those types of things that you get with a psychologically healthy and safe workplace as well.
Yep. And reduction of claims, of course.
Of course.
As well.
Yeah. And just to, with that regulatory impact statement, thank you. That was produced by Deloitte. I think they've also, in some instances, looked at worst case impact on a business in terms of time and cost requirements. I think there's definitely, if you read between the lines, much more benefit for companies to do this properly than there is cost.
Yeah.
So currently the regs are published in draft, and so they're open for public consultation. Are there limits on who can participate in the consultation?
There are no limits on who can participate. So we would encourage employers, employees, and other interested parties, members of the public, to make submissions on the proposed regs and associated regulatory impact statement as well. So,
what about listeners from Canada? Can they comment?
Yep. I had queried if it was just Victoria, and I've been advised there are no limits.
Well, there you go. International listeners, get in there and provide your feedback.
Our listeners just love reading through regulations and standards.
You know what? I bet some of them do.
Well, there's always some.
There is always some. So for people who do want to contribute to the consultation process, how can they do that?
So the Victorian Government's consultation website is Engage Victoria, and I can give you the link to put with the podcast. It's engage.vic.gov.au/proposed-psychological-health-regulations.
We'll put that in the show notes.
We'll add that in the show notes.
Yeah, it could have made it easier, right, Libby?
You can just go to engage.vic.gov.au and search for psychological health.
Okay. Yeah. We'll put it in the show notes, listeners. So yes, we'll make it nice and easy for you. Libby, it's actually been a while since we've been trying to get you on. Working for a regulator, we find they can be difficult. We're still waiting for WA in Queensland to give us a representative from the regulator to come on. But I guess this is actually really great timing, right? Given, this is the first time in Australia that we've seen regulations specifically dealing with psychological health being published. So great time to do it whilst it's in this period of consultation and people can have their say. So probably worth the wait, I would say, Libby.
I think it's really good timing, actually. I think there's a state of readiness where people are aware that there's a need, and we've seen claims increasing of late, and there's been a little bit of a downturn in Victoria while we've been in lockdown, but in general the trend was going up when it came to claims. So, and I think with all the reviews that have happened recently, there is very much a state of readiness for clarification on what they can do, workplaces in particular can do to prevent these injuries increasing.
Yeah, that's right. And the more education I think employers can have about the systemic risk-based approaches to dealing with this rather than the individual public health type approaches, I think the better. But Libby, I might be able to guess what your answer might be to this, but we ask all of our guests the same question. What are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
I want it to be second nature. I want organisations to understand that they should focus on the prevention. They should focus on their systems and getting them right, because the benefits are there for the individual and for the organisation. Changing the way that we work to make it better for their employees and better for their own outcomes as well.
Yeah, I like that idea about being second nature. I was speaking to another person that we both know today, and she was saying she would love it if all line managers off the top of their head can name the 5 biggest psych hazards within their particular team. And just second nature like that, right? So like everyone can talk about, the golden rules and what are the biggest kind of physical safety risks within their work environment. So if people could just, rattle off what were the big psych hazards and what they were doing about it, that would be amazing as a second nature. I agree.
So, Libby, do you have some words of advice for listeners who would like to work in the field of psych health and safety?
Yeah, I just think that this is such an important area where we can make such a significant difference to people's lives and workplace outcomes as well. And the focus on it is only going to increase. It's going to be an area where you can make such a significant difference. So I highly recommend anyone who's interested in working in this area, definitely pursue that.
Yeah, we've seen a lot more jobs from the regulators around Australia being put out in this area of psychological health. So I think that's probably sending a signal to businesses as well that this will be heavily regulated in the future.
But lots of jobs from larger businesses as well now in this space. So it's definitely a growth area.
Yeah, it'd be great for anyone who's done org psych or a health and safety degree with further education, I guess, around psychosocial hazards. So, I think it's a definite growth area, as you say, Libby. Yeah. Libby, it's been fantastic having you on. I can't wait to see you back in the West again once the borders are open, and they will be open almost by the time we air this episode.
Yeah.
So it won't be far. I know the last time you came over, it had to be cut short because of our emperor over here. So it will be good to see again, but really fantastic the work that your team and the broader WorkSafe Victoria are doing in this space. It really is leading the way, not just in Australia, but internationally as well, to have regulations in this space.
Thank you, Jason and Joelle. It's been so good to talk to you.
Great. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. So don't forget, we do video these over our Zoom calls that we have while we're recording. So you can check out the video if you prefer that over the podcast medium on the Flourish GX YouTube page. We'll also take out some clips from this, as we do with all of our other guests, and put them on the Flourish GX LinkedIn page. While you're on LinkedIn, you can connect with Joelle and myself. We always like to continue the conversation, so slide into our DMs, and you can find out more information, as Libby said, on the Engage site, which we'll link in our show notes, and also through the WorkSafe website, as well as their social media presence as well. So thanks a lot, listeners. We will catch you next episode.